Hey everyone, I'm Alex, and today on Big Al Books, I'm doing part 2 of my July reading wrap-up. No, I do not have a tan yet, but I do have good news in that the stack of books that I'm going to be talking about is fantastic. So if you remember part 1, I had kind of a lot of mediocre, just okay, 3-star reads to start off my summer vacation reading list, but then I stepped it up a notch. The books that I've been reading so far have been truly excellent. So I'm going to try to do this in favorite to least favorite again, but honestly, it was really hard to decide because I like a lot of these books for a lot of very different reasons, so it kind of seems a little arbitrary. But let's start off with some of the 5-star reads that I read this month. The first of my 5-star reads for the month has to go to Hagseed by Margaret Atwood, and I have to say this was a complete surprise for me because this is in the Hogarth Shakespeare series, which basically are modern retellings of Shakespeare's plays. This one is based on The Tempest, which is not one of my favorite Shakespeare plays, and it is written by Margaret Atwood, who is not one of my favorite authors. In fact, the last of her books that I read was The Robber Bride, and it left this terrible taste in my mouth. I really felt like I was over Margaret Atwood after reading that book, but then I gave Hagseed a chance and this book completely blew me away. It was such a pleasant surprise. This book was one of those right place at the right time kind of reads. I had just reread The Tempest and had gone to see it live for the first time, so the play was really fresh in my memory, so it was a lot of fun watching Margaret Atwood interact with the text in this novel in some ways that were very overt and obvious and a little over the top, but also in some ways that were a little bit more subtle, and she definitely gave me some new perspectives and some different ways to think about the play that made me appreciate it a lot more than I thought that I originally did. But mostly what I loved about this novel is just that it is so much fun to read. Like, I just didn't want to put this book down. It's about a man named Felix, who is the artistic director of a prestigious theater company in Canada, which is clearly based off of the Stratford Festival, which is about an hour away from where I live, so that was kind of exciting reading the references to that. He's kind of at the top of his game, but then he gets fired and basically is planning revenge, so he's sort of the Prospero character of the text. He gets a job teaching Shakespeare to prison inmates, and that is how he's going to plan his theatrical revenge. So everything about this play is so ridiculous, and I didn't want to give this 5 stars because the way that Margaret Atwood writes about prisoners is so unrealistic. Like, these are just like the sweetest, happiest gang of inmates that you'll ever meet. They choose these nerdy little stage names, and they don't swear at each other, but instead use Shakespearean insult. So the prisoners were just completely unrealistic, but at the same time, it was so much fun to read about them. They were very charming, so I couldn't help but just love the story, and I really wanted to race through it to see what was going to happen, so it was really a lot of fun. There is something so outrageous about her take on The Tempest. I never thought that she would have been able to pull it off. It is risky, it's creative, and it is so extra and over the top, but at the same time, it was just so much fun, and that's what I'm here for at the end of the day. You know, I just want to have a laugh while I'm reading, I want to have a good time, and this book delivered that in spades. I was just so charmed with this book, and this was my first book in the Hogarth Shakespeare series, so I'd be curious to know, anyone watching, if you've read any books in this series, because I'm very curious about where to go next. So if you have any recommendations, please let me know, since I'm definitely more interested in this series than I was before after being so impressed with Hagseed. Speaking of books that are a lot of fun, I also have to mention the comic book series Saga. I finally took the time to get caught up with the series. I started back in March, I think I read volume 1, then at the beginning of the month I read volume 2, and now throughout the month I have finally caught up and I read through volumes 3 to 8. So now I'm currently caught up with the series and it feels so good. I won't say anything spoilery about this series since I know that a lot of people haven't started yet or are only midway through, but I will say that I have just fully jumped on the bandwagon for this series. It's just so brilliant, and it always seems so extravagant, and it's set in space, and it's about intergalactic warfare. There's so much sci-fi and fantasy elements to this story, but at the same time, it is really just like a domestic family drama. So Saga is giving me the same feels that all of my favorite multi-generational family saga kind of novels do, and I think that that's just so brilliant since since the medium that it communicates through is just so different. And it's very funny and it's very gory, but at the same time, it is just so emotional. And so many of these volumes just leave you thinking about life and your own family and all the big questions. So I'm just so impressed with what this series is doing right now, and I just can't wait to see where it's going to go next, and I'm glad that I can follow along the ride as it's happening. The next book that I'm going to talk about is a nonfiction read that I started back in March, and I finally had the time to finish in July. This is a nonfiction book called At the Existentialist Cafe: Freedom, Being, and Apricot Cocktails by Sarah Bakewell. And this is a lovely book that is just kind of a nice, easy breezy overview of the existentialist philosophical movement. I used to associate existentialism with moody teenagers, those feelings of alienation that you have when you're growing up. So I don't know what's going on with me in my life, but existentialism has just been resonating with me a lot over the past few months. So I just wanted a book that could help me really learn some of the basics about this movement, and this book is just perfect for that. It introduces you to all of the major players, so some of the earlier philosophers that you need to understand, like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Heidegger, and also then the famous French pack where you've got your Jean-Paul Sartre, your Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus. And what I love about how Sarah Bakewell does this is that she really introduces these philosophers as people, and she gets into their personal lives. It's not all just about their work and their theories. She writes about their contradictions and how they changed throughout their lives, how their relationships with each other changed and developed over the years. So it was just a really fascinating story. Now, I know very little about proper philosophy. It was never a subject that I've really studied very much, but Sarah Bakewell is really blessed at making these intense philosophical ideas palatable. They go down real smooth, and I came away from this book feeling like I sort of have this basic understanding of what's going on, which I think is going to be really helpful because reading this book definitely inspired me to expand on my collection of existentialist works. You can sort of see behind me here, I've got a few of them, so I am kind of prepared to delve further into this world, but this book was just a really nice starting point, and I would highly recommend it if you're interested in learning more about this movement as well. The next book I have to talk about is There by Tommy Orange. This is a debut novel that I'm sure you've been seeing all around BookTube. It's really been making the rounds lately, and I've had a few conversations with people about this book in regards to all the hype that it's receiving, and whether this book is worth the hype. So I just kind of wanted to quickly address that, in that I feel like hype really doesn't do any book any favors, and if you go into a book really having those high expectations, it usually doesn't work out that well. I don't want to generalize, but I feel like sometimes people feel like when they read a book by an Indigenous author, they want to read a book that will like encapsulate the Indigenous experience, and it'll be like the one book kind of similar to the Great American Novel that will just like explain everything, make everything very clear, and also be a fabulous novel on top of that. And I think that that book is not really going to happen because, as Tommy Orange explores in his book, every Indigenous person has their own experience for what it means to be Indigenous. So there's really not going to be that one perfect book out there for anyone. So I think we should really stop trying to look for that and instead focus on all the amazing books that we have, these artists who are presenting their views of reality in such beautiful and complex ways. So Tommy Orange is playing with multiple narrative perspective to really make that point. Each of his characters are different. They have different ways of experiencing the world and different ways of feeling Indigenous. And I think that that helped make this book a really great statement on the topic. So personally, is it worth the hype? I mean, I don't know, but for me, I thought it was a really enjoyable novel. I made a review video talking about this book in greater detail, so if you're interested in that at all, I will link that down below. But really, the long and the short of it is I enjoyed this book quite a lot, glad that I checked it out, and I'm very curious to see where Tommy Orange is going to go next. The last book that I have to talk about today is also my least favorite of the batch. It's also a classic, and that one is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Now, I immediately picked this one up after finishing Robinson Crusoe a few weeks ago because I thought these two narratives might be comparable in some sort of way. Robinson Crusoe gets in a shipwreck, so does Gulliver like 4 times in this book, so I thought there might be a bit of a comparison there, although they ended up being completely different books, and this book was quite different than what I was expecting it to be at the outset. Basically, this book is a very satirical story. It's about a traveler. He gets stranded in 4 different distant lands, and each of them have some kind of jab about humanity and his life back home. So I think the 2 most famous places that he ends up is Lilliput, where he is surrounded by little people and he is giant in stature, and also a land where he himself is tiny and the people surrounding him are really big. But then there were 2 other places that I didn't know anything about before going into this. The 3rd place he goes to is a place that is obsessed with mathematics and music and logic, but they don't apply them in the same way that people in Western society do, so it seems like it doesn't make any sense. That was definitely the weakest of the 4 in my opinion. And then the 4th and final adventure Gulliver has is he travels to a land where horses are rational beings and they are masters, and humans are looked upon as very disgusting, deficient creatures. The 4th narrative was my favorite for sure. There's a scene where he is trying to explain English society and life back home to these horses, and like they just don't understand because it doesn't make a lick of sense. So it was really funny to see Western society flipped back at us from such an absurd perspective. So there are some very clever moments in this book, but ultimately my problem with this is a problem that I have with a lot of older satirical novels, in that I really like them in concept, and you know, there are a lot of clever ideas that go into it, but the execution can just be so painful to read sometimes. Like, it was a bit of a struggle to get through this. I didn't love the language and the way that Swift writes, so though I thought his satirical jabs are kind of funny, I wasn't having a lot of fun while I was reading it. It's only kind of afterwards, when you detach from the book, you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of clever, but it didn't make for a very laugh-out-loud funny reading experience, which I was kind of hoping for. So that's kind of the downside with satire. You know, if you're gonna read a novel, I want the novel to be entertaining on its own merits, not just for roasting society. So I'm glad that I gave this one a read, but I did not enjoy this one nearly as much as I was hoping to, and it honestly felt quite like a chore to get through this book. So that's it for part 2 of my July reading wrap-up. I still have been reading quite a lot, so I'm hoping to see you again quite soon in part 3. Until then, take care, and thank you so much for watching.